Dr. Riley Nakamura had been having a perfectly ordinary shift aboard Haven Point Medical Station when everything went to hell. She was reviewing trauma protocols in the main surgical bay when the emergency klaxons started screaming. Not the gentle chimes that announced routine medical transports, but the bone-deep wail that meant someone was dying and time had run out 3 systems ago. All senior medical staff to Bay 7 immediately, announced Station Commander Voss over the comm, his usually calm Aldrin voice tight with something Riley had never heard before: panic. Priority Alpha medical emergency, diplomatic immunity protocols in effect. Riley grabbed her medical kit and sprinted through the station's corridors, her earth-trained reflexes carrying her faster than most of her alien colleagues could manage. Haven Point was neutral territory, a massive medical facility floating in the DMZ between 3 major galactic powers. They saw everything here: industrial accidents, combat trauma, exotic diseases from unexplored worlds. But Priority Alpha meant someone important was dying, and diplomatic immunity meant the wrong outcome could start a war. Bay 7's blast doors cycled open to reveal controlled chaos. Medical teams from 4 different species worked frantically around 3 transport pods, their alien voices creating a multilingual symphony of professional urgency. Riley caught sight of the patients and felt her blood go cold. Kitharans, 3 of them, and they were dying. The Kitharan Republic was one of the galaxy's major powers, known for their diplomatic core and their crystalline physiology that made them nearly impossible to treat with standard medical techniques. Their bodies were silicon-based, with internal structures that resembled living gemstones more than traditional biology. Most doctors considered them essentially untreatable. Their physiology was too alien, too fragile, too different from carbon-based life forms. Dr. Nakamura, Commander Voss called out, his 6 arms gesturing frantically. "Thank the void you're here. We've got 3 members of the Kitharan diplomatic mission to the Centauri Accords. Their ship was attacked in neutral space, some kind of energy weapon that's incompatible with their crystalline matrix." Riley moved toward the nearest transport pod, her trained eye immediately cataloging injuries. The Kitharan inside was barely conscious, his translucent blue skin flickering with erratic bioluminescent patterns that she knew indicated system-wide trauma. Fracture lines ran through his torso like cracks in expensive crystal, and some kind of dark energy was spreading through his internal light channels. "What have you tried?" she asked, pulling on surgical gloves with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd performed emergency medicine in active combat zones. Dr. Thailan Ka, the station's head of xenobiology, approached with his usual methodical precision. The tall, gray-skinned Zeltharian had been practicing medicine for over 2 centuries, and his expertise in non-carbon life forms was legendary. Right now, he looked defeated. "We've attempted standard crystalline repair techniques," he said, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into calm, professional tones. "Harmonic resonance therapy, matrix stabilization, quantum coherence adjustment. Nothing is working. The energy contamination is spreading faster than we can contain it." Riley knelt beside the transport pod, studying the patient more closely. The Kitharan's breathing was shallow, and the fracture lines were definitely spreading. In her peripheral vision, she could see the other 2 patients in similar condition, surrounded by increasingly desperate medical teams. "How long do they have?" she asked. "Maybe 20 minutes, Thailan Ka replied. "Possibly less." Riley felt the familiar calm that always settled over her in critical situations. This was what she trained for, not the specific physiology, but the essential challenge of keeping someone alive when everything should be killing them. Earth had taught her that biology, no matter how exotic, followed certain fundamental rules. The trick was figuring out which rules applied when you didn't have time for careful analysis. "I need to examine them," she said, standing up. "All 3, and I need the medical teams to step back." There was a moment of silence in the bay. "Dr. Nakamura," Thailan Ka said carefully, "while I respect your expertise in trauma medicine, Kitharan physiology is extremely specialized. Their crystalline matrix is unlike anything from your homeworld, perhaps if we—" "With respect, doctor," Riley interrupted, moving toward the 2nd patient, "my homeworld tried to kill everything on it for 4 billion years. I've learned to work with whatever biology shows up." She reached the 2nd transport pod and immediately saw that this patient was in even worse condition. The dark energy contamination had spread through most of his torso, and his bioluminescent patterns were becoming increasingly erratic. But as she watched, she began to notice something the other medical teams had missed. The contamination wasn't random. It was following specific pathways through the Kitharan's body, channels that looked almost like a circulatory system, but moved light instead of blood. "This energy weapon," Riley said, still studying the patient, "what exactly did it do?" Commander Voss consulted his datapad. According to the survivors' report, it created some kind of cascade failure in their ship's bioneural network. The weapon seemed designed specifically to disrupt crystalline matrix life forms. Riley nodded, pieces clicking together in her mind. She moved to the third patient, confirming her suspicions. The contamination was definitely following the light channels, but it wasn't random damage. It was almost like an infection, spreading from cell to cell through the Kitharan's natural communication pathways. I have an idea, she said, turning back to face the assembled medical teams, but you're not going to like it. Dr. Thylankaw's large eyes narrowed with concern. What do you mean? The contamination is acting like a hostile organism, Riley explained, her mind racing through possibilities. It's using their natural light channels to spread, just like a virus uses a circulatory system. Standard crystalline repair techniques won't work because they're trying to fix the damage without addressing the cause. You're suggesting we treat it like an infection, asked Dr. Melara, the Centaurian biochemist. But Kitharans don't get infections. Their crystalline structure is inherently sterile. Everything can get infected if you use the right vector, Riley said. On Earth, we've seen pathogens that can attack everything from bacteria to whales. The key is understanding how they spread and cutting off their transmission routes. She moved back to the first patient, her hands hovering over the fracture lines in his torso. I need to create isolation barriers in their light channels, basically quarantining the uncontaminated sections from the contaminated ones. But to do that, I'll need to interrupt their bioluminescent flow at multiple points. The silence in the bay was deafening. Dr. Nakamura, Thylankaw said slowly, what you're describing would require direct physical intervention in their matrix structure. That's not possible. Kitharan physiology is too delicate for invasive procedures. Any attempt at direct manipulation would cause irreversible damage. Riley met his gaze steadily. Not if you know what you're doing. What you're suggesting is medically impossible, Dr. Thylankaw said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 centuries of experience. Kitharan crystalline matrices can't be directly manipulated. Their internal structures are more delicate than anything in known medicine. Riley was already pulling surgical instruments from her kit, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd learned surgery under combat conditions. Everything's impossible until someone does it, she replied. On Earth, we used to think you couldn't perform heart surgery or brain surgery or operate on someone while they were conscious. Turned out we just needed better techniques. She approached the first patient, a young Kitharan whose identification showed him as cultural attaché Zenra of the diplomatic mission. His bioluminescent patterns were becoming increasingly chaotic, and the dark contamination had spread to nearly 30% of his matrix structure. The fundamental problem, Riley continued, activating her diagnostic scanner, is that you're treating them like delicate crystal sculptures. But they're not sculptures, they're living beings with biological systems that want to survive. She studied the readouts, her mind processing the alien physiology through the lens of Earth medical training. Kitharans might be silicon-based, but they still had circulation, respiration, and nervous systems. The specifics were different, but the underlying principles were the same. Their light channels are analogous to circulatory systems, she said, more to herself than the watching medical teams. The contamination is spreading through them like sepsis. So we treat it like sepsis. Identify the source, cut off circulation to contaminated areas, and support the healthy systems while the body fights off the infection. Dr. Melara stepped closer, her forearms crossed in the Centaurian expression of deep skepticism. Even if your analogy is correct, Kitharan light channels can't be cut off without causing permanent damage to their consciousness. Their thoughts are transmitted through those same pathways. Not all of them, Riley said, pointing to her scanner readouts. Look at the pattern distribution. There are primary channels for consciousness and secondary channels for basic biological functions. The contamination is spreading through both, but it's moving faster through the secondary channels because they have less cognitive resistance. She was making educated guesses based on her observations, but her instincts, honed by years of trauma medicine in impossible conditions, told her she was on the right track. If I can create temporary blocks in the secondary channels while leaving the primary consciousness pathways intact, I can isolate the contamination and give his immune system a chance to fight it off. Thylankaw's expression was unreadable, but his body language suggested he was torn between professional skepticism and desperate hope. Even if your theory is correct, the precision required for such a procedure, the margin of error would be microscopic. Riley looked up from her scanner and smiled, the same expression she'd worn when performing surgery in field hospitals on Earth, where the alternative to trying was always death. Doctor, I learned to operate on people while mortar rounds were exploding 50 meters away. I've performed brain surgery in dust storms and treated sucking chest wounds in the back of moving vehicles. Precision under pressure is what humans do. She turned to Commander Voss. I need surgical authorization for experimental treatment. Time's running out. The Aldrin commander looked around the bay at his assembled medical teams, then back at the dying patients. You really think you can save them? I think they're dead if we don't try, Riley said, and I think being from a death world gives me a different perspective on what's survivable. Voss nodded slowly, authorization granted. Dr. Thailanka, please assist Dr. Nakamura with anything she needs. Riley was already moving, her hands flying over her surgical kit as she selected instruments. Most of them were designed for carbon-based life forms, but the principles of precision cutting and microsurgery were universal. I'll need the bioluminescent imaging system focused on the patient's torso, she said, and someone monitoring his consciousness patterns. I want to know immediately if I'm affecting his primary thought processes. As the medical teams scrambled to adjust their equipment, Riley studied the patient more closely. The contamination was definitely spreading, but it was following predictable pathways, if she could interrupt those pathways at strategic points. Beginning preliminary incision, she announced, activating a crystalline scalpel designed for Kitharan physiology. Targeting secondary light channel junction at coordinates mark 74. The scalpel sliced through the patient's translucent skin with surgical precision, revealing the complex crystalline structures beneath. Riley had expected to find something like organs, but Kitharan internal anatomy was more like a three-dimensional circuit board made of living light. Fascinating, she murmured, adjusting her approach. It's not really biological at all, is it? It's more like bioengineering. She located the secondary light channel she was targeting and carefully began the process of creating a temporary blockage. Using a technique adapted from vascular surgery, she placed microscopic clamps at strategic points, effectively creating a tourniquet for light instead of blood. Contamination spread rate decreasing in sections 7 through 12, reported Dr. Mellara, monitoring the patient's condition. But I'm also seeing reduced efficiency in his metabolic processes. That's expected, Riley said, moving to the next junction point. We're essentially putting part of his body into medical stasis. He can survive reduced efficiency for a while, but he can't survive total contamination. As she worked, Riley found herself falling into the focused state that had carried her through countless emergency surgeries. The alien physiology became just another puzzle to solve, another set of biological systems that needed to be understood and manipulated to preserve life. Second junction blocked, she announced. Moving to tertiary pathways. The procedure was unlike anything she'd performed before, but the underlying principles were familiar. Control the damage, support the healthy systems, and give the body a chance to heal itself. Every life form in the galaxy, no matter how exotic, followed those same basic rules. Dr. Nakamura, Thailanka said, his voice carrying a note of amazement, the contamination spread has stopped. In fact, it appears to be receding in some areas. Riley allowed herself a small smile as she moved to the next patient. Kitharan immune systems are more robust than anyone realized. They just needed the contamination isolated so they could identify and eliminate it. She began working on the second patient, her movements becoming more confident as she better understood the alien physiology. This patient was more severely affected, with contamination covering nearly 60% of his matrix structure, but the same principles applied. This is impossible, Dr. Mellara said, watching her scanner readouts in disbelief. According to everything we know about Kitharan medicine, this procedure should have killed him instantly. The problem with everything we know, Riley said, carefully placing another light channel clamp, is that it's usually based on assumptions about what's safe rather than what's possible. She paused in her work, looking up at the assembled medical teams. On Earth, we have a saying, first do no harm. But sometimes, when someone is dying, the only way to avoid harm is to do something that looks harmful to someone who's never faced that situation. As she continued working, Riley began to understand something that had been nagging at her since she'd first seen the patients. The Kitharan's crystalline physiology wasn't just different from carbon-based life, it was actually more resilient in some ways. Their matrix structure could withstand direct manipulation that would kill most organic species. The third patient is stabilizing, reported one of the monitoring technicians. All contamination markers are dropping below critical levels. Riley moved to the final patient, the most severely affected of the three. This one had contamination covering nearly 80% of his matrix structure, and his bioluminescent patterns were barely detectable. This one's going to be difficult, she said, studying the readouts. The contamination has reached his primary consciousness pathways. I'll need to work around active thought processes. Is that possible? Commander Voss asked. Riley was already beginning the initial incision. On Earth, we've been doing brain surgery on conscious patients for decades. The trick is understanding which parts you can touch and which parts you can't. As she worked on the final patient, Riley found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she was doing. For centuries, galactic medicine had been based on the assumption that certain procedures were impossible, certain species were untreatable, certain injuries were automatically fatal. But those assumptions were based on the medical knowledge of species that had evolved on relatively safe worlds. They'd never been forced to develop the aggressive, improvisational techniques that Earth's hostile environment had demanded. Contamination eliminated in all 3 patients, Dr. Malera announced, her voice filled with something approaching awe. Full matrix stability restored, consciousness patterns normal. Riley stepped back from the surgical table, pulling off her gloves with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd just achieved the impossible. All 3 Kitharan patients were stable, their bioluminescent patterns returning to normal, the dark contamination completely eliminated from their systems. How did you know? Thylanka asked quietly. How did you know that would work? Riley looked at the elderly Zeltharian doctor, considering her answer. Because on Earth, everything that can go wrong usually does go wrong, all at the same time in the worst possible circumstances. You learn to work with whatever biology shows up, because waiting for perfect conditions means people die. She gestured toward the recovering patients. Your medical knowledge is incredibly sophisticated, but it's based on treating healthy species from safe worlds. Earth taught me to treat injuries that shouldn't be survivable, using techniques that shouldn't work, under conditions that shouldn't allow for medical intervention. Deathworld medicine, Commander Voss said, understanding dawning in his voice. Exactly, Riley replied. When your planet spends 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it, you get very good at keeping things alive against impossible odds. 3 hours later, Riley was in her quarters, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion that always followed emergency surgery. Her hands were steady, they always were during a crisis, but now she could feel the slight tremor that came after pushing herself to her professional limits. The door chimed, and she looked up to see Dr. Thylanka standing in the entrance, his expression thoughtful. May I come in? He asked. Riley gestured to the chair across from her desk. Of course, how are the patients? Fully recovered, Thylanka said, settling into the chair with the careful grace of his species. All 3 are conscious and alert. Cultural attaché Zenra specifically asked to speak with you when you're available. That's good news. Riley leaned back in her chair, studying the senior doctor. But I'm guessing that's not why you're here. Thylanka was quiet for a moment, his large eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. Dr. Nakamura, in my 230 years of medical practice, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished today. The precision, the innovative thinking, the willingness to attempt procedures that every established medical protocol says should be impossible. He met her gaze. It was extraordinary, and I need to understand how it was possible. Riley considered her answer carefully. She'd been asked similar questions before, usually by alien colleagues who couldn't quite grasp how human medicine worked. It comes down to perspective, she said finally. Most galactic medical training is based on species that evolved in relatively stable environments. Your homeworlds didn't spend millions of years trying to kill you, so your medical traditions focus on precision, careful procedures, and avoiding unnecessary risks. She stood up and moved to the viewport, looking out at the stars beyond Haven Point. Earth was different. Everything there evolved in constant competition with everything else. Predators that could adapt faster than their prey, diseases that could evolve around immune systems, environmental conditions that changed faster than organisms could adapt to them. And that affected your medical training how? Thylanka asked. It made us aggressive, Riley said. Human medicine isn't just about healing, it's about fighting for every patient, using whatever tools are available, accepting calculated risks because the alternative is always death. She turned back to face him. When I was learning surgery, my instructors used to say that the human body wants to live. It will fight to survive injuries that should be fatal, endure procedures that should be impossible, and recover from conditions that should be permanent. Our job isn't to baby it through careful, minimal interventions. It's to give it every possible advantage in that fight. Thylanka nodded slowly. You treated the Kitharans the same way, as if their bodies wanted to survive and just needed the right support to do it. Exactly. Their crystalline matrices are actually incredibly resilient. The problem was that your medical traditions were so focused on avoiding damage that they wouldn't risk the aggressive intervention needed to save them. The door chimed again, and this time Commander Voss entered, his expression grim. "Dr. Nakamura, I need to speak with you immediately," he said. "We've received a priority communication from the Galactic Medical Council." Riley felt her stomach tighten. The Galactic Medical Council was the ultimate authority on medical practice throughout the civilized galaxy. They set standards, approved procedures, and had the authority to revoke medical licenses for anyone who violated their protocols. "What did they want?" she asked. "They're sending an investigation team to Haven Point," Voss replied. "Someone reported that unauthorized medical procedures were performed on the Kitharan patients, procedures that violated established treatment protocols for crystalline matrix life forms." Riley exchanged glances with Thylan Ka. "Did they mention any specific concerns?" "They used the term barbaric intervention," Voss said. "The investigation team arrives in 6 hours, and they want to interview all medical personnel involved in the treatment. Dr. Nakamura, they specifically requested that you be available for extended questioning." After Voss left, Riley found herself alone with Thylan Ka, who was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you concerned about the investigation?" he asked. Riley shrugged. "I saved 3 lives using techniques that worked. If the medical council has a problem with that, they can explain to the Kitharan Republic why they think those diplomats should have died instead." "The council has significant authority," Thylan Ka warned. "They could revoke your medical certification, ban you from practicing in galactic space, even recommend criminal charges if they determine your actions were reckless." "Let them try," Riley said with more confidence than she felt. "I followed sound medical principles, achieved successful outcomes, and the patients are alive. Everything else is politics." But privately, she was worried. The Galactic Medical Council represented the medical traditions of dozens of species, most of whom had never faced the kind of desperate situations that defined Earth medicine. To them, her techniques probably did look barbaric, even criminal. The next few hours passed slowly. Riley reviewed her medical logs, documented her procedures in excruciating detail, and prepared for what was likely to be a very difficult conversation with investigators who wouldn't understand her methods. Just before the investigation team was due to arrive, she received an unexpected visitor. Cultural attaché Zenra stood in her doorway, his crystalline features showing the subtle bioluminescent patterns that indicated gratitude in Kitharan culture. "Dr. Nakamura," he said, his voice carrying the musical tones of his species. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank you personally before the medical council investigators arrive." "How are you feeling?" Riley asked, gesturing for him to enter. "Better than I have any right to," Zenra replied. "Dr. Thylan Ka explained what you did, how you used techniques that no one else would have attempted. You saved my life and the lives of my colleagues." He paused, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to something that looked like determination. "I also wanted you to know that the Kitharan Republic is fully aware of what happened here today. We've submitted our own report to the Medical Council, strongly supporting your actions and requesting that your techniques be studied and adopted as standard emergency protocols for crystalline matrix species." Riley felt a wave of relief. Having the patients themselves support her actions would carry significant weight with any investigation. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I want you to know that I would have done the same thing regardless of who you were or what species you belonged to. It's what doctors do." Zenra's patterns shifted again to something that looked like respect. "That, Dr. Nakamura, is exactly why the galaxy needs more doctors like you." The Galactic Medical Council investigation team arrived precisely on schedule, which somehow made Riley more nervous than if they'd been late. 6 beings representing different major medical traditions in the galaxy, all carrying themselves with the authority of those who'd never had their decisions questioned. The lead investigator was Dr. Venthmore, a cetacean whose reputation for rigid adherence to medical protocols was legendary throughout galactic space. Her aquatic species had developed some of the most conservative medical traditions in the known galaxy, focusing on minimal intervention and careful observation rather than aggressive treatment. "Dr. Nakamura," she said without preamble, her translated voice carrying the cold formality of an inquisition, "you stand accused of performing unauthorized medical procedures on 3 Kitharan patients, using techniques not approved by any recognized medical authority, and endangering patient lives through reckless intervention." They were meeting in Haven Point's main conference room, with Riley facing the investigation team across a table that felt uncomfortably like a judicial bench. Commander Voss sat beside her as the station's representative, while Dr. Thylan Ka and Dr. Melara flanked the table as witnesses. I stand accused of saving 3 lives, Riley replied evenly. Everything else is a matter of perspective. Dr. Venthmore's expression didn't change. Please describe in detail the procedures you performed. Riley went through her actions step by step, explaining her reasoning and the results of each intervention. As she spoke, she could see the expressions of the investigation team members growing increasingly skeptical. You're describing direct physical manipulation of crystalline matrix structures, said Dr. Korathnell, a Xantharian specialist in exotic physiology. Such procedures have been attempted before and have invariably resulted in irreversible damage or death. By doctors who didn't understand what they were dealing with, Riley replied. The problem with established procedures is that they're often based on fear of failure rather than understanding of success. You're suggesting that centuries of medical research by multiple species was simply wrong? Dr. Venthmore asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Riley leaned forward, meeting the investigator's gaze directly. I'm suggesting that medical research based on avoiding risk isn't the same as medical research based on saving lives. She activated the conference room's holographic display, showing the biometric readings from the 3 patients. These are the results. All 3 patients fully recovered, with no permanent damage to their matrix structures. No loss of cognitive function, no reduction in their bioluminescent capabilities, no side effects of any kind. Results that could have been achieved through proper procedures given more time, Dr. Korathnell argued. Time that the patients didn't have, Riley shot back. They were dying. Every minute we spent following proper procedures was a minute closer to losing them. Dr. Thylan Ka cleared his throat. If I may, distinguished colleagues, I was present for the entire procedure. Dr. Nakamura's techniques, while unconventional, were based on sound medical principles and demonstrated remarkable understanding of Kitharan physiology. Dr. Thylan Ka, Dr. Venthmore said, while your support for a colleague is understandable, we must consider the broader implications. If we approve aggressive intervention techniques simply because they occasionally produce positive results, we open the door to reckless experimentation throughout the galaxy. Riley felt her patience beginning to fray. Occasionally produce positive results. I saved 3 lives. That's not occasional, that's 100% success rate. In a single case, Dr. Venthmore replied. Medical protocols are based on reproducible results across multiple cases and species. Your techniques might work for Kitharans, but they could be lethal for other crystalline matrix species. Then test them, Riley said. Study them, figure out why they work and how to adapt them for other species. Don't just dismiss them because they don't fit your established procedures. The investigation continued for hours, with the team dissecting every aspect of Riley's treatment decisions. They questioned her training, her experience, her understanding of galactic medical ethics. Through it all, Riley maintained that her actions had been necessary and appropriate given the circumstances. Finally, Dr. Venthmore called for a recess to allow the investigation team to deliberate. This isn't going well, Commander Voss said quietly as they waited in an adjacent conference room. I know, Riley replied. They're not interested in whether what I did worked. They're worried about the precedent it sets. Dr. Thylan Ka looked troubled. The Council has significant political pressure to maintain stable medical standards. Even if your techniques are superior, adopting them would require acknowledging that their current protocols are inadequate. Politics, Riley said disgustedly. People are dying because of politics. When the investigation team reconvened, Dr. Venthmore's expression was grimmer than before. Dr. Nakamura, while we acknowledge that your actions resulted in positive outcomes for the specific patients involved, we cannot ignore the broader implications of approving techniques that violate established medical protocols. Riley felt her heart sink. However, Dr. Venthmore continued, we have received official communications from both the Kitharan Republic and the Centauri Medical Institute, requesting that your techniques be formally studied and potentially incorporated into emergency medical protocols. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. Additionally, we have reviewed your medical background and training records. Your experience with trauma medicine in hostile environments is extensive. Riley waited, sensing there was more. The Council has decided to take the unusual step of authorizing a formal research program to study your techniques, under controlled conditions, with proper oversight from established medical authorities. Relief flooded through Riley, but Dr. Venthmore wasn't finished. This authorization comes with conditions. You will work directly with Council-approved researchers. All procedures must be documented in detail. and any future use of these techniques must be approved by the relevant medical authorities before implementation. Riley nodded. I can accept those conditions, as long as they don't prevent me from treating patients who need immediate care. Emergency situations will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, Dr. Venthmore replied. But Dr. Nakamura, understand that you are being given an extraordinary opportunity. Do not make us regret this decision. 6 months later, Riley found herself standing in the main lecture hall of the Galactic Medical Institute, facing an audience of physicians from across known space. The formal research program had exceeded everyone's expectations, with her techniques proving applicable to multiple species and dozens of previously untreatable conditions. The key insight, she said, advancing to the next slide in her presentation, is that aggressive intervention isn't the same as reckless intervention. When you understand the underlying biology, you can push systems to their limits without exceeding them. In the audience, she could see Dr. Thailan Ka nodding approvingly. He'd become one of her strongest advocates, helping to design the research protocols that had validated her techniques. Beside him sat cultural attaché Zenra, who'd insisted on attending the presentation despite his busy diplomatic schedule. The success rate for crystalline matrix emergency procedures has increased by 300% using the modified protocols, Riley continued. But more importantly, we're now treating patients who would have been considered hopeless cases under the old system. During the question period that followed, a young Alderan physician raised her hand. Dr. Nakamura, your techniques require a level of precision and intuitive understanding that seems almost superhuman. How do we train physicians to replicate your results? Riley smiled. You start by changing how you think about medicine. Instead of asking, what's the safest thing I can do? Start asking, what's the most effective thing I can do? Safety comes from understanding and skill, not from avoiding action. She gestured toward the data displayed on the screen behind her. Earth medicine developed under conditions where conservative treatment meant certain death. We learned to be aggressive because aggression, properly applied, saves lives. After the presentation, Riley found herself surrounded by physicians eager to discuss specific cases and techniques. The enthusiasm was gratifying, but what pleased her most was seeing how quickly her colleagues were adapting and improving on her methods. Dr. Thailan Ka approached as the crowd began to thin. Congratulations, Dr. Nakamura. You've revolutionized galactic medicine. We've revolutionized it, Riley corrected. I just brought a different perspective. It took all of us working together to make it practical for widespread use. She looked around the lecture hall, watching physicians from dozens of species discussing techniques that had been considered impossible just months before. This is what I hoped would happen. Not just adopting human medicine, but creating something better by combining the best insights from all our medical traditions. As they walked out of the institute together, Thailan Ka asked the question that had been bothering him for months. Riley, what you accomplished at Haven Point, the precision, the intuitive understanding of alien physiology, the willingness to attempt procedures that should have been impossible, that wasn't just training, was it? Riley considered the question as they moved through the institute's corridors. No, it wasn't just training. On Earth, medicine isn't just about following procedures. It's about fighting for every patient, using every tool available, never accepting that someone has to die just because their condition is difficult. She paused at a viewport showing the sprawling medical complex below them, where physicians from across the galaxy were learning techniques that had once seemed impossibly aggressive. Earth taught me that biology wants to survive. No matter how alien, how exotic, how different a life form might be, it's fundamentally designed to keep living. Our job as physicians isn't to be careful with that drive to survive. It's to support it, enhance it, and fight alongside it. Deathworld medicine, Thailan Ka said, understanding. Exactly. When your planet spends 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it, you learn that life is tougher, more resilient, and more adaptable than anyone gives it credit for. You just have to be brave enough to trust it. As they reached the Institute's main entrance, Riley's communicator chimed with an urgent message from Haven Point. Another medical emergency, another species with supposedly untreatable conditions, another chance to prove that the impossible was just another word for difficult. I have to go, she said, checking the details of the emergency. Thailan Ka smiled. Of course you do. Save lives, Dr. Nakamura, it's what you do best. Riley headed for the transport that would take her back to Haven Point, where patients were waiting who needed someone willing to fight for them with techniques that the galaxy was still learning to accept. Behind her, the Galactic Medical Institute continued its work of spreading the revolutionary idea that sometimes the most advanced medicine looked exactly like controlled barbarism. applied with precision by someone who'd learned to practice medicine on a planet where everything wanted to kill you. And across the galaxy, patients who would have died under the old protocols lived because a doctor from a deathworld had taught the universe that aggressive compassion, properly applied, could achieve the impossible. 1 year later, Riley stood in the observation deck of the New Horizon, the galaxy's first mobile emergency medical facility designed specifically for impossible cases. The ship was heading toward the Outer Rim, where a colony ship full of refugees from the Thalashan conflict was experiencing medical emergencies that no one knew how to treat. Dr. Nakamura called Dr. Liana Singh, one of the human physicians who joined the program after hearing about Riley's success. We're receiving updated medical data from the colony ship. The injuries are extensive. Riley moved to the command center, studying the incoming data streams. 18 different species, all suffering from exposure to some kind of exotic radiation that was breaking down their biological systems at the molecular level. Traditional medicine would classify most of them as terminally ill. "What's our ETA?" she asked. 4 hours, replied Commander Thexvos, the Kitharan officer who'd volunteered to command the emergency vessel. After cultural attaché Zenra's recovery, several Kitharans had become advocates for aggressive emergency medicine. Riley nodded, her mind already working through possibilities. 4 hours to figure out how to save 18 different species from radiation exposure that their own medical systems couldn't treat. "Assemble the medical team," she said. "We've got work to do." As the crew prepared for another impossible case, Riley reflected on how much had changed since that day at Haven Point. The techniques she'd developed were now taught at medical schools throughout the galaxy. Emergency medical protocols had been revolutionized. Most importantly, physicians were beginning to think differently about what was possible. But for Riley, the most satisfying change was simpler. Patients who would have died were living, and doctors throughout the galaxy were learning that sometimes the most sophisticated medicine meant being willing to fight for every life with whatever tools were available. The New Horizon continued toward its destination, carrying a crew trained in the radical idea that biology wanted to survive, and that the job of medicine was to support that drive with aggressive compassion and the willingness to attempt the impossible. In the galaxy beyond, other emergency cases waited, other supposedly untreatable conditions, other chances to prove that deathworld medicine wasn't just about human techniques, but about a fundamental approach to healing that put the patient's survival above the physician's comfort. And in medical facilities across known space, physicians were learning that the most important question wasn't, "What's the safest thing I can do?" but "What's the most effective thing I can do for this patient who's counting on me to fight for their life?" Dr. Riley Nakamura had given the galaxy more than new medical techniques. She'd given them a new way of thinking about medicine itself, one that assumed life was worth fighting for, that biology was tougher than anyone realized, and that sometimes the most advanced treatment was the willingness to be aggressive in service of keeping someone alive. The Deathworld doctor had taught the universe that medicine wasn't just a science, it was a declaration of war against death itself, fought with precision, compassion, and the absolute refusal to accept that anyone had to die just because their condition was difficult. And across the galaxy, lives were being saved because someone from Earth had proven that impossible was just another word for challenging, and that the best medicine came from doctors who'd learned their craft on a planet that never stopped trying to kill them.